welcome to this lesson on the poem Muliebrity by Sujata Bhatt. I don't know how to say Muliebrity, so I'm gonna just put that out there now before you're like, hang on, my teacher said it differently or whatever. So yeah, message me if you know how to pronounce this word. I should have probably looked it up. Um, I know what it means, and that's the main thing, because when you write an essay, no one's gonna hear you anyway. So I will definitely be good at teaching you what it means, even if I'm not good at saying it. So yeah, the first thing, as always with my poetry lessons, just make sure that you pause me and read the poem aloud to yourself. I always say this, I wonder if anyone actually ever does it. It's definitely good to do that. It gets stuck in your head, it helps you remember quotes, it makes you notice more things about the sound of it. It helps you kind of like internalize the ideas of the poem in a different way. So 100% definitely read it aloud to yourself before we carry on, unless you're super pressed for time, in which case read it aloud at another date. So yeah, pause me now. Once you've read it, we're going to have a look at the vocab. So this the vocab, this word again, muliebrity, it's a noun and it means kind of like womanliness or femininity, sort of. It's something that gives an impression of very womanly traits. When I think of the word feminine versus the word womanly, in my head or in my kind of like, the connotations that I associate with those words are a little bit different. So it might be interesting for you to do that same exercise. Like, do you think femininity and womanliness are the same? I feel like girls and, I feel like femininity is like a light quality, like quite a light-hearted quality, whereas womanliness is kind of deeper and stronger in a way. Like womanliness, I equate with like motherhood and strong kind of female characters, whereas femininity, I think women obviously can have that femininity as well, but I think also girls can be feminine, whereas they're not necessarily as strong as like a mother would be. So in my head, personally, for me, those words are slightly different. And muliebrity relates more to this like womanly thing than it would just to femininity in general. So yeah, just have a think about that and how you relate to those words personally, and read a bit more about that word if you're a little confused on it, because obviously it's the title, so it kind of sets the tone, it sets the theme for the whole poem. And the only other real word that I thought might be difficult was maninaga, which, again, sorry if you're Indian and I'm pronouncing it wrong. I'm even quarter Indian myself, and I'm like conscious that this is not sounding very Indian right now, especially not Gujarati. So I apologize. But this word, it's an area of, here we go, Ahmedabad city in the Gujarat region of India. So within India, it's kind of a Gujarati location, like a locale. The main thing is that it's a temple that's there, and this girl passes by the temple, and also the poet's house happens to be on this same road that has the temple and has this girl. So with that, we're going to have a look more at the story now. So the speaker tells us that she's thought a lot about this girl who gathered cow dung, which is cow pats, cow muck, along the road where she used to live in India, passing by a temple. So she has this basket, and she kind of carries quite a heavy basket and goes scooping up cow dung and collecting it in this basket. And the memory of this girl, which I found quite beautiful about this poem actually, is mixed with other memories that appear in the form of scents. So it's all kind of what we call olfactory imagery. It's to do with the nose. We'll look at that in a minute in the language. So there's road dust, canna lilies, monkey breath, washed clothes, dust from crow's wings, and then the girl. So she kind of goes through this kind of memory. She travels through it via smells that were evoked at this moment in her life, things that she remembers smelling. It's quite interesting. You can maybe do the exercise now if you have time to write down some location that you visited as a child or even lived in as a child that you don't have any connection to anymore, and how that smelled. So not what did it look like or what was it like, but what were the smells you associate with it there? Because you start to kind of change your memory of it, or kind of tap into a different part of your memory if you do that. So it's quite, I feel quite sensitive and quite interesting that she's remembering via scent rather than just via how it looked. One of the weirdest memories I have is not when I was a child, but it's a time when I remember like a scent more than anything else. Is when a few years ago, maybe quite a long time ago now. Time goes really strange when you're my age. Um, yeah, like 5 years ago. Anyway, I went to Australia, and I'd never been sort of really outside of Europe, apart from like North Africa a little bit at this point. So I hadn't travelled much around the world, and I wasn't really used to different places and how they feel and smell and so on. And I got off the plane, and this like wall of scent hit me, and it was just crazy. It was like the whole air was perfumed as soon as I touched down in Australia. And it's this thing called a lemon scented gum, which is like a type of tree they have up there. It's beautiful, but so strange. And I remember, everything about Australia was very strange. Like I left England in the winter and I arrived right in the middle of summer. So that's odd. And the landscape was like a desert, and there's all this kind of stuff that's really strange. But the strangest, most powerful memory I have is of that lemon scented gum smell. And if I smelt that, in a perfume or in a spray or whatever, I would instantly be transported back to that place. So smell has this really powerful capacity to transport you into memory, and she's using that here to explore this memory of this girl. Yeah, so do the same. Sorry, I was just like rambling about my memory then, but I was trying to recall it properly. Hopefully, you're doing something similar with your own memories. So she keeps going back to this girl as a really significant moment in her life at this time when she was living in this part of India. And she kind of says she wants to use her as a symbol for Muliebrity, for feminine power, for womanliness, for beauty, and so on. But something in her resists this, something in the girl and something in the poet herself. So instead, she just writes a poem about her and kind of leaves it open ended, like we're supposed to interpret her how we want. She doesn't exactly want to turn her into a metaphor because she's her own person and she's her own individual character. She's not just like, a stereotypical woman how we would expect. There's something very unique and individual about her. So she doesn't necessarily suit being turned into a symbol of all womanhood, or all womanhood, or all femininity. So it's kind of half of a narrative poem, a little bit of a story, but also half of what we call a lyric poem, where it's just exploring a concept or an idea without really having a full narrative, a full story progression. So I feel like it's somewhere in between those two types of poetry. So we'll have a look at the speaker and voice now. The speaker uses a nostalgic tone. Nostalgia is a really nice word, so make sure that you're confident on that one. Hard to spell at first, but worth it. Worth learning to spell that word for your English. Yeah, so kind of looking back into past memories, into kind of like things that felt comforting and homely when she was a child. And they're all centered around this girl that walks up and down the road collecting the cow dung. She's kind of confused almost in herself. Why does she keep thinking about this girl? But there's something very powerful and significant about her, and even if she can't quite put what it is into words, she feels like this girl deserves to be written into a poem. Like her readers, the poet's readers, deserve to know about this really special lady. So it's personally important to her, but it's also important to all of us, which is why it's a poem that, why we read it as a poem. She's written it for her readers. And again, she's not stereotypical. She doesn't want to turn her into just a random standard symbol of womanhood because she's an own individual person. She's not just like any woman could be. So yeah, language then. We've got visual imagery. And this is kind of like mostly, I think, centered around the girl. So things like wide round basket, the way she moved her hands and her waist, the greatness and power glistening through her cheekbones. So she sort of fixates on little details, or she remembers little details of her, and all of these details make up the whole character of this girl. It's very respectful, and it shows kind of her captivation as a child, being fascinated by this girl who is probably not even a particularly old lady. I imagine her myself as a teenager, maybe, doing this kind of work. So, from a child's point of view, she's old, but not from my view now. She'd be a lot younger than me, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it shows an attitude of respect. We have this sense of olfactory imagery as well that I was exploring earlier. So, a lot of this memory is smell based. I've written quite a lot of different analyses here, so feel free to pause and read through, or download this document if you're on the Scribbly School, and yeah, and have a look through in more detail. I've sort of touched on them, so I'm not going to go into loads of detail with that. The only thing is this last one where she goes, the dust from the crow's wings, which is a different kind of smell from the road dust. I don't know if that stood out to you, but it stood out to me because I was like, hang on, you're smelling dust again, but a different dust. And so I had to kind of think about it for a while and be like, oh, what does she mean by that? And I think what she means is that the crows travel from somewhere else, so the smell that they bring is different from the earth that she's used to smelling, and that kind of for her is like a symbol of travel, because she's, as a poet, Bhatt is like a kind of Anglo-Indian poet, and she lives in the UK now, I think. Let me just Google this. I'm going to just pause myself. Don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Yeah, I just looked it up. Interestingly, very strange, not what I was expecting. She lived in America for a bit, so the US, and now she lives in Germany with her German husband. But she does teach in the UK, so she teaches at Nottingham Trent University. So yeah, so kind of all over. She travels a lot. So the sensitivity to the different smells and feelings of places when you travel is something that is very much in her nature as a poet. So I find it quite interesting, that the little image there. A couple more techniques that we have. Anaphora, which is where you repeat a phrase or the beginning of a sentence more than once. So in this case, I have thought so much is repeated. It emphasizes that phrase, like almost like this kind of image of this girl is obsessing. It's kind of taking over Bat's mind to the point where she's obsessed with it and she can't forget it, and she feels like, oh, I've got to do something with this girl because she keeps cropping up in my memory. Sometimes that happens to me. I don't know if it ever happens to you, but I just like have an idea in my head and it just keeps going around until I actually do it. I sort of had it with Scribbly and the school, because I kind of planned making an online school for maybe 2 years before I started fully committing to making it, because I was kind of winding down other stuff and trying to clear space in my life so that I could spend ages recording things and making content and stuff. So yeah, for 2 years I had this thing, and sometimes I'd work quite a lot on it, and sometimes I'd just have weeks where I don't do anything. And if I stop doing stuff, it'd just like niggle at me, like it just keeps going, like cropping up until you're like, okay, fine. And I write poetry and I write stories, and ideas are similar. I find the creative process when you write those things. I'm going to actually start uploading some of my stories as creative writing examples for English language, so look out for those if you're interested in that kind of thing. But yeah, I feel like I kind of empathize with her here, that sometimes, if you're a creative person, this idea kind of follows you, or it keeps appearing until you do something with it and you feel a lot better for it. And I feel like this image of this woman is kind of that for Bhatt, and maybe she was waiting until she knew what exactly to do with her. She never really got to that point and she felt guilty, so then she turned it into a poem. So it's nice because it's got this kind of incompleteness and this rawness to the image of it, and it feels kind of unfinished as a poem. You'll notice that it kind of trails off, it ends in a dash as well. So yeah, we've got like adjective, the word nice. Feel free to read through my analysis of that if you're kind of interested in that one. We also have this idea of metaphor, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail. So basically, she says, I have been reluctant to use her as a metaphor. So that's important, because instead of being like, oh, the woman is a metaphor, you have to be like, the woman is not a metaphor. So don't say she's a metaphor. Even though the word metaphor appears in this poem, it's a bit like a red herring, like it's distracting you from what the real thing is. So the word appears because she isn't a metaphor. She doesn't want her to turn into just a symbol. She's very much herself, this girl. She has her own character. She's strong and capable as a woman, but she's more than that. She's her own unique individual, and she's personal and distinct. So, yeah, I think there's this sense, I feel as well, that she has a quiet dignity. Dignity is where you're like, your character is strong and you're kind of honorable, but you're also, you don't kind of like go tell everyone about how great you are. So she's really great, and she just kind of keeps it to herself. And even though she's doing a very lowly task, like a very kind of meager task that wouldn't pay very much if it paid anything at all, and it seems kind of gross, I personally wouldn't really like the job of going and collecting cow poo for whatever reason, even if it's spiritual. And, you know, I fully believed in the spirituality of it, which we'll get to in a minute because I think that is part of it here. But yeah, personally, I'd find this quite a difficult job to do, and I probably wouldn't enjoy it, and I maybe wouldn't do it with dignity. I probably wouldn't do it with dignity. So yeah, if you think about, like, you know, this task that she's performing and how she has this grace and this beauty and this strength of character, despite the fact that it's a very simple task. It's a very it's a kind of task a lot of people would refuse to do and think it's gross and it's beneath them, and probably you feel similar to me about it. So something interesting about the strength of character expressed in this woman, um, and how that comes from the fact that she's doing this very basic and quite undesirable job. So a couple of techniques then. We have this idea of a single stanza. So I feel like this is just a kind of, it's almost like a bubble of a memory that kind of pops on the surface of her mind or something like that. For some reason, I decided to explain it in a poetic way, but hopefully you know what I mean by that. Like it's this kind of memory that's kind of appeared on the surface, and it's just like one complete idea and feeling and emotion, and then it dissolves back into her subconscious. So it feels like the incompleteness of it is true to how memory actually works. So that makes it quite a modern feeling poem, because modern poetry tries to capture that incompleteness of memory. I'm going to actually write that one in. So it relates to modernism, the movement of modernism, which you're welcome to Google and go more into. I did mention this one already, but I'll just kind of go through it again quickly. It ends with a dash, like it's trailing off mid-sentence. And again, that emphasizes this incompleteness. It sort of feels like she doesn't know what to say about this it's a weird thing, and she doesn't even consciously know why her brain keeps bringing it up. It's almost a subconscious process. So yeah, I'll write that in here as well so that you can use that for your analysis. Subconscious process. Okay. Meaning she's not actively even, you know, fully aware of the significance of this girl. It's more something in her internal conscious, her subconscious. Sorry, getting this word confused. Make sure you know what this means as well. Subconscious. It's like not actively the part of your brain that you're aware of, something more hidden. Yeah, and finally, there's a lot of enjambement, which means that there's a sort of fluidity to the poem that's kind of flowing. And to me, again, that's the fluidity of memory. So the fact that a memory can kind of flow and kind of, if you start trying to think of a memory, like if you go back to when I was saying, think of a time, a place you visited as a child that you've not been back to. If you start thinking about that, you'll start getting way more details and like little bits of that memory kind of appearing. So I feel like the enjambement allows for that. It kind of captures that part of the memory process. I normally do themes at the bottom and context before, so I'm going to actually just switch this around. There we go. Don't know why I did it that way around on this one. Yeah, a couple of context points then. So it's based on a childhood memory of the poet. Usually the speaker is like, you'll always, if you take any other poetry classes with me, I'll be like, the speaker is not the poet, don't say they're the same, blah, blah, blah. In this case, I feel like the speaker actually is the poet, so ignore what I say in other ones. I think in an interview that I read by Bhatt, by the poet, she did actually say this is her personal memory and she's kind of the speaker of the poem. So you can go ahead and say that. I think I've spelled this word wrong as well. I'm sorry. Yeah, so she's the speaker, it's her memory, and it's a very personal poem that means a lot to her. The the Radhavala temple is a Hindu temple in the Gujarat region. So it's a type of temple. You can probably even Google image search that so that you have a better picture in your head of what that looks like and what the landscape is around it. I recommend using Google Images as much as possible with your poetry because it just helps you, like, you shouldn't have to just picture everything in your own head. Like, use images to, get you there, help you picture. Muliebrity, however you pronounce it, it also means womanhood in Gujarati. So it's a really significant word to this poet because in her original language, this word has the same meaning as it does in English. So it's going to be kind of comfortable for her, that word is going to feel like, regardless of what language she writes about it in, she fully understands what it means. And she's actually a poet that's really interested in language, and she has other poems about how difficult it is to speak in a language that is not your native tongue, and that kind of thing. So language is very important to this particular poet, to Bhatt. And yeah, cows. I was talking about cows a little bit earlier. They're really sacred in India because of the Hindu religion. So to a Western audience, to someone who is not raised Hindu, even though I'm part Indian, my grandmother converted to Islam, so I was raised Muslim rather than Hindu. So yeah, I don't have it ingrained in my culture, and you possibly, unless you actually are Indian, you don't have it in yours either, that cows are a sacred animal. So to us, it seems like it possibly is disgusting, or it's very beneath us to go around with a basket collecting cow pats. But in Indian culture, we could interpret this as like a kind of holy or spiritual process, or maybe a practical process, because cow pats are a really good fertilizer. They're a really good natural fertilizer. So the girl performs this task gracefully, and she doesn't have this kind of disgust or hatred of what she's doing. And it's really important that you analyze her that way. You don't just kind of analyze it from your point of view, where you're like, this is gross, I wouldn't do it, kind of thing. This is quite interesting. She was born in 1956. She's like in her 60s now. So her childhood memories are of the 1960s in India as well. So they're quite old-fashioned that way. And India still has this a lot today, but particularly in that time and before, there's something called a caste system, which is just really similar to the classes that we have in Western society. It's actually, I think, probably imposed by Westerners when they colonized India. So, yeah, there's a very strict class system in place that is to do with like hierarchy. So you can't really, if you're born poor, end up, married to a rich person, or there's no what we call social mobility. You can't change your class, the level that you're born into. And so a cow dung collector is a very low class type of person. So this woman is doing what we would consider a really gross, disgusting task, and she's also the lowest possible class in the Indian caste system. But there's something powerful about her anyway, and it kind of makes it even more powerful that she transcends all of these things that we would consider bad, or oppressive in a way. She's still this very powerful kind of feminine or womanly figure that emerges out of all of this. So hopefully you've got a bit of a grasp on this one. You're feeling like you know how to analyze it. I'm going to leave you with some themes as always to just kind of figure out. So with these themes, just have a look at what you think the message is of each one. So we call this a thematic statement. So you just go into like, what is the final message on womanhood or hard work or memory or spirituality and so on. How does the poem relate to them? So hopefully you enjoy doing that as a final task today, and hopefully you like this poem. I really like this poem. I think it's really beautiful. So yeah, I hope to have instilled that feeling in yourselves as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure I'll see you guys soon.